Hi, I'm Andrea Waddell. I am a California-based abstract painter and educator. Welcome. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I harmonize color in oil and cold wax, and also how I balance composition and arrived at this painting. It started off with loose acrylics, a loose floral abstract where I was free and just letting it go. And then the next layers were done in oil and cold wax, and I have a previous video on that if you want to check that out. And that was still kind of free flow, adding a little bit of texture and color and just kind of playing with that. And in this final phase, it was more honing in and harmonizing the color, balancing out the composition in the way that I wanted it to balance. And I filmed that whole process. I hope you get something out of watching it. And again, if you like these videos, please go ahead and hit subscribe, hit like. That supports me, and I can come back and just create more content for you. Let's get going. Okay, so when I'm looking at the painting, this is where I arrived after adding some texture and cold wax and just kind of playing with it. And I can see that this is unresolved. And the first thing that I notice is the colors are out of harmony. And if I'm trying to explain that to you, here's what I can say. So the base, this sort of negative space area, and I was actually really trying to keep more negative space in here than I was able to in the way that I layered, all of this and all of this. Anyway, there isn't enough negative space there. That's problem number one. So I can go and fix that. But in terms of the color issue, is this base is not a color that I tend to usually use. I deliberately like to challenge myself as an artist and wanted to choose something that was maybe a little bit dull, that wasn't necessarily a color that I liked, and to see how that would push me to create some sort of balance with that. I like that kind of a challenge for myself. So this color was created with my Indian yellow, my phthalo blue, my burnt sienna, and some titanium white. And so these colors here aren't working with this base because they aren't related, if that makes sense. So for example, if I look at this blue here, if I had added some phthalo to that blue, then that would work a lot better, as I had done over here. This is a phthalo green, and that's working with this base. I could have also added sort of a yellow, this Indian yellow, and gotten maybe something that would have worked better. Same with this magenta red is really not working. But if I add maybe some of this burnt sienna and give it more of an orange look, that'll start to work better. And I can just come across here and look at all of the other areas where there is sort of a similar problem. Even these greens aren't necessarily working that well. If I gave them a little glaze, maybe with my Indian yellow, it might start to harmonize. And same with this big purple blobby thing here. And you can see there's an Indian yellow that I have used here, and that works great. I think I got rid of it, and it's like the thing that works the best. Okay, next problem that I can see is a composition problem for me, for what I'm trying to create. And again, I wanted a lot of negative space, and negative space is really quite tricky to create when you're working loose, when you're working in oil and cold wax, because we love oil and cold wax because of all the layering we can do. And here's another layer, here's one, here's one. And if you want to leave the original negative space that you started with, it's harder because you have to be a lot more deliberate, if that makes sense. So here, what I'm looking at, what draws my eye, is there's this big clump of stuff here, no negative space in it. And the first thing I want to get rid of is this right here. So that's issue number one. Then we have this sort of like joining thing here where it's like this, I don't know, carousel wheel or something where I'm joining the two shapes together, and that doesn't work for me. And by the way, also another challenge, this format of canvas is something that was given to me, and I'm not used to working and composing with this format. And that's another challenge I like to throw at myself. So I wasn't quite used to it. And so I have this little joining thing that's not working. And then this clump over here. Again, another clump with no negative space, breaking up the shapes. And I look at clump number one, clump A, clump B, pretty much the same size. And so no, you don't know where to look. So, okay, I have two things to work with here. I'm probably going to start by bringing some negative space and editing out a bunch of this. And then I'm going to fix the colors. I'm going to show you what I'm doing with my palette. So I want to bring in a little transparent red. I'm going to use some of the things that I used to create this kind of strange base color. I'm going to use this transparent red, some radiant white, some radiant turquoise. I'm going to keep working with my phthalo green. I'm going to bring in some of this Fanchon red. And then for my gray, I'm going to mix all of those colors all together. I'm going to see what kind of weird looking color comes out of the mix. And then I'll keep mixing that up until I get an interesting gray that will harmonize with everything. I should do a whole video on that another time, not for today. Here I go. Also alizarin. Yes. All right. Let's start. Also some India yellow. That's my palette. There's pretty much all of these colors in my base, so I'm hoping that it harmonizes pretty well. We'll see. I've decided that I want my background color to be just a little bit warmer, so I've added some Indian yellow, and I'm mixing my oil and cold wax to add to that negative space that I have. And because I've decided also that I want to work with a brush, I'm going to be adding some Galkide to create a more fluid mixture to my oil and cold wax. And that will allow me to use a brush more easily rather than a brayer or a palette knife. So now I'm coming in with that new background color, which is very similar to the original. And I am going to start editing out. And because I wasn't able to create, just to let my hands go and create shapes, leaving the original background, a lot of it down there, I am now going to just add it back in, because my concept for this painting originally, the way I wanted to challenge myself, which is very hard in oil and cold wax, was to have enough of let's say, the negative space and the positive space to be equally beautiful shapes. And it's tricky to do that in oil and cold wax because we're layering, we're being spontaneous, and we cover a lot of stuff up. So I'm editing out quite a lot. And I've said in a video before, one teacher taught me that 80% of one thing and 20% of another creates harmony. So I'm kind of moving towards that direction where I'm going to have 80% background and maybe a little more than 20% are the shapes, the remaining shapes. So I'm really taking out quite a lot. And as you can see, I'm working with a brush, and this is oil and cold wax on canvas. So all the things that I've said in previous videos about it really, oil and cold wax works best on a board, I think you can use it this way too, very effectively. I hesitated about leaving just maybe a little bit of that cooler green shape in the middle, and then I decided to get rid of it. And so now I've got some interesting rhythm going. I've got some repetition of those two shapes, of the florally shapes. They're different enough from each other to keep it interesting. And as always, I paint the sides of the canvas, especially when they're a little bit thicker. It just makes it cleaner. So here's where I've gotten to after editing out a ton. And now I'm coming in, and rather than having a drip, and plus I can't have a drip because it's so thick, the paint, I wanted to create some fine white lines. And now I'm adding some deep shadows with that palette. And remember, the palette that I have created, there is at least one common color in all of the colors that I am adding. So it instantly harmonizes with that background color, which is a strange color. Again, I like to challenge myself. I don't usually use that kind of strange green, but it's got enough of a mix of colors in it that I can find one common color for all the other colors that I'm going to be adding to keep it fun, except for that Fanchon red. I want that to be really something that just stands out, and it gives a whole lot of emphasis, especially in that lower part of the canvas. And warm colors pull us forward, and cool colors recede backwards. So now I'm adding some sort of beautiful, cool turquoise. I love the way that turquoise looks against that green. So that is my radiant turquoise, and I have mixed some of the other colors in it so it works well. And again, I've challenged myself here. I'm not used to working in this large format. This is an 18 by 36. And so often when I am composing, I'm composing in a square, and I'm really used to having a sort of something to the one side and something maybe to the other side, or maybe a circular movement. And this is really different. So I noticed I was building up my composition in that way. I had something to the right, something to the left, and there was definitely something needed in the middle that was sort of a repetition of shapes, or sort of that florally idea, and different enough from what was going on to the right, which isn't resolved yet, and to the left, that it would kind of create some interest. So I'm not looking at anything here. I'm just, these are sort of made up flowers. I've sketched it out, so I have an idea of where I'm going. That is a very beautiful gray. You can't really see it, but I was really happy with that gray. It's a mix of all the different colors. And I've decided this white shape should just be a little bit bigger. And since this is alla prima, so it's wet on wet, I'm pulling that gray down into my white, and I keep doing it. So I'm coming in with my palette knife, trying to get some cool, clear, clean white. Adding a little dot there just to create some balance, or, you know, have a little friend. If there's a little bit of something in somewhere on the canvas, it's a good idea to try to find another place to add a color. I'm scraping back in. So I think the thing with oil and cold wax on canvas, you can do a lot of the same things, you just can't be quite as rough when you're scraping back. So I'm adding some shapes, and this time I want it to come right out of the design field. So to at least have one thing that comes off to the side and stretches right to the very edge. So I'm paying attention to those edges, and a lot of the other shapes don't come to the edge. Most of them do. So if one of them does, that's always interesting. And to the left, I've added the negative space, so none of those shapes come to the edge. Adding some more of that gray, which is a mixture of all the different colors and a little bit of white. All the colors on the palette mixed with white. So they appear related. Now, as you can see, I'm holding my brush at the very sort of end of the brush so that I don't kind of control it too much, if that makes sense. So I get an interesting line that way. Adding some lines, so we've got some negative space, positive space, shapes, harmonizing color, and it needed some lines. Adding little bits of lines here, making sure that none of them hit dead center, a little bit off, and holding my brush in a way that really keeps it loose. And I'm going to wind up creating more of a paler color for that shape that I just put down, to have it blend in a little more to the background. So it's not in harmony quite yet, but we're getting closer, little by little. Now I'm going to start to edit out everything that's around those red shapes so that we really look at them and don't get confused. So I'm adding some of my gray in there, and the gray again was a mixture of all the colors. and looking to create sort of, again, these are sort of a loose floral idea of floral-like shapes without it being explicit. I'm not looking at a floral, I'm imagining them. Yeah, I decide I really want a lot of emphasis right there. And that red wasn't popping out in the way that I wanted it to. So this time I've come in with more pure color, and I'm using the palette knife so we really see the red. And that really starts to punch up the canvas quite a lot. And we look right there. That warm color is really pulling us forward. And I've used that same red and added some of my titanium white, and I've got that sort of pink color. I can never get away from pink. I always have to add it somewhere. And that shape, that little center shape, was starting to look awkward. So I blotted it out with one of my cloths, so it's not quite as noticeable. I'm getting closer to the end here. Adding a little bit of a lighter gray, and that gray is cool. And so the cool gray next to that bright red is a temperature change, and so that bright red jumps out even more. I really like that effect. Now I'm just trying to fix the edges of this big center shape because it is so prominent. I don't want any hard edges there. I want to soften those a little bit. And also hard edges pull things forward too. So maybe I might have a little bit more of a hard edge at the bottom of that shape, and I leave that. And I tried to soften a little bit. I didn't do much of it on the top. And I left the black shape, that sort of middle-y piece, blurred. Yeah, this is when I start to blend that in. And it's the same thing, that shape right there next to the blue, the turquoise blue next to it. That's warm. So we have a temperature change there. We've got that as warm. The blue next to it looks beautiful. And I decided I want to blend it in so that you almost can't see it, like a shadow. I like the way that came out. I start to add a little bit of, just a little, it was too much of one color, so I'm adding a little bit of some light spots. On that blue center shape. And some final line work. Because I lost that little white dot that I had put earlier on, and there's that white flower shape to the right. I know I needed to balance and find some white somewhere, so I thought I would do that with a line. And here I try to go back in with the light, thin lines that I wanted, but I can't do it. It's too wet. I have to wait for it to dry, and I'll come back in with some very, very thin white charcoal because I want a bunch of very, very straight, thin lines. I keep trying because I'm stubborn. And there we go. That's about as far as I can take it. Just a little, just a few changes to round that little shape out a little bit more. A couple of tweaks here and there. And I was, pretty happy with the way that turned out in terms of what I was trying to do. Negative shape, positive shape, a balance of color against a strange backdrop.